So thanks very much, folks, for coming along. It's a fairly cold night out there, following on from the bad weather that we've had. So it's an excellent way to start our fireside talks, I think. So yeah, welcome. This is the first presentation in what is now our third year of the fireside talks. This year, all of our talks link in with various projects that have been going on across our area that explore the use of language and our understanding of place. It gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Lauren and Néill, who will be talking about places, language, and our shared heritage. I was privileged to hear Lauren speaking on a similar topic at the end of last year, and I can think of nobody better to kick off this year's Fireside Talks. So thank you very much, Lauren.
Great. My hugget. I'm just going to share my screen. So bear with me. So hopefully everybody can see this okay. If not, please give me a shout or unmute yourselves and let me know. And I suppose when Nick had asked me to do this talk, I'm working on a project with Conradh Gaeilge at the minute, which looks at our place names and the linguistic origins of our place names. And we go around, I've been going around different schools, different community groups, different areas right across the 11 council areas here, delivering talks, workshops, and we've got a bilingual book on linguistic origins of place names here. So I suppose whenever Nick had asked me to take part in this series of really interesting talks, I thought, gosh, what kind of angle will I take on this idea of place names and languages within place names? Because usually I'm traveling somewhere. I suppose it's a great thing that we're now able to go out and do workshops, and but also in that weather, it's brilliant to have the facility of Zoom to log on like this and to gather together. So I thought, okay, well, I can't really do what I usually do, which is really hone in on that specific townland and the surrounding townlands of the area that I'm visiting that night. So I started to think about place names, and I suppose just place names that I maybe hadn't seen very commonly, elements within place names that I hadn't seen, that I wasn't too sure of myself. And I thought these are kind of intriguing and interesting. So I hope you enjoy, and there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end. So I suppose when we take the first question I always try to address when talking about place names is actually understanding what a place name is. So a place name is what it says in the tin. It's very much the name that's given to a place. And the first reference that we see to place names right across Ireland is in Ptolemy's geography. And that was around 150 AD. And Ptolemy basically illustrated, he depicted a map of what he described as Ireland at the time, and he included some names on that. And we see one particular name which is of real interest, which is Logia, which was one of the first references that we could probably attribute to the River Lagan in Belfast, and he notes that as you can see in the illustration that's referring to the River Lagan. So whenever we talk about place names, we're really talking about something that is so old here. It precedes nearly a lot of what we can trace back in terms of tradition. And it very much is part and parcel of how we live today as well. So it's got a very interesting kind of trajectory over the years through languages and through different people that use these place names historically. From that depiction onwards, we probably see our first references to place names in the Irish language and in Latin, because as we know, Latin would have been used very much associated with ecclesiastical practices. And we see references to these place names from the 6th century onwards, and then we see our first kind of collection of place names in the 1800s, which was through the work of the Ordnance Survey, and of course John O'Donovan was instrumental in that work at the time. So this is just to give you, I suppose, a snapshot of some of the sources that I would be looking at on a day-to-day kind of basis and working on place names work and research. So this is the illustration I was talking about, Ptolemy's geography. So I think he's done a pretty good job. I'm not sure that any of us could do any better than that, but it's quite an accurate representation. And I was talking about Logia, and hopefully you can just see here Logia written, and Hibernia written for Ireland. So it's a really interesting map to have, and it really just shows us how far back our place names tradition really dates back, and how place names were used at such an early stage. It's such a basic part of day-to-day living. I talked then about the collection of place names, so the Ordnance Survey maps, and there's a great access to some of these maps online through the Prony maps viewer. So you can just go onto Google and type in the Prony spatial maps viewer, and you can see each of the maps. So this is a particular map of Ballycastle Bay and that area from the second edition, which was the 1846 to 1862. And you can see that there's names written on these, and we'll look in a little bit more detail about some other kind of depictions and some clues we can see on these maps to help us in our place names research as well. So whenever we think of places or place names and languages, we see a lot of different languages in our place names tradition. And whilst today, I mean, I go out to a lot of schools, and for the most part, and I wouldn't have been any different when I was at school, when I read a road sign, when I look at a place, I assume that because I can read those places and I speak English, that those place names all came from the English language. But that's not true. About 95% of our place names come from the Irish language. And that's why some of our place names, I always think now it makes sense to me why they've got kind of funny spellings, or why, for example, there's certain place names that we can recognise a word in English, such as town, for example, but in other place names we see words such as bally, and in the English language we can't really understand what does that word bally actually mean, and that's because it comes from a different language. So that example comes from Bwalya a lot of the time, which is the Irish word for a townland or a settlement. So whenever we look into these languages, we actually get a really robust view of not only our local place, the features of that place, the people that lived in that place, but as well of just history and how that place name has changed over time, and the different languages and the different people that have left their footprint on our landscape that we maybe didn't know about before. As well as that, we see a lot of English language place names. We'll look at a few examples after. We see Scots place names as well, of course, in Ulster, particularly in the counties Antrim and Donegal. We see quite a heavy influence of Scots in these counties compared to others, of course, because of travel and the closeness and geographical distance, I suppose, to Scotland as well. So we see Scots elements in our place names too. And then, believe it or not, we see some French in our place names, not too much, but a little bit of French, and Old Norse as well. And Old Norse would have been the language that was spoken by the Vikings many years ago. So, of course, the Vikings invaded Ireland at quite an early period, and they left their footprint on our landscape as well. So whenever we understand these place names and we look into the different languages and how they've changed over time, it really gives us an idea of the different languages that have spoken, and as well just a little bit more about that place, about what actually it means, what were the features of that landscape historically, and how did our ancestors kind of work and live in that place at the time. So I said that about 95% of our place names come from the Irish language, and we see this from the 6th century really in writing onwards. And I remember, I'll talk to you a little bit later about our podcast series. So as part of the People and Place project that I've been working on, we've created a podcast series, and I'll maybe send you the link to it, but I've got a few slides on it as well. And I remember talking to Professor Néill and he is the director of the Northern Ireland Place Names project, which is of course based in Queen's University in Belfast. And Néill, of course, is a lifetime of experience and expertise in researching the different languages that have kind of left their footprints and their marks on our different place names. And I remember him telling me that when he's doing this research, it's difficult to comprehend how I suppose strenuous and how challenging this work can be, because really any written source that was ever, any source that was ever written, any written piece of work can be a potential source, a potential piece of evidence to figuring out what that place name originally was and how it changed over time. So it's quite different in terms of a subject area to be researching in that really any piece of written work or any piece of recorded material could potentially be key in kind of helping, I suppose, conduct that research. So it's undoubtedly very challenging, but very, very worthwhile in kind of highlighting our shared history here. So until about the 17th century, of course, Ireland or Irish was the primary language throughout Ireland. And to put it in context, by about 1704, only about 14% of Irish land was in the possession of Irish people. So what we see, of course, through the plantation and various different movements, that we see Irish being the predominant language, the dominant language in Ireland, and then slowly but surely this changing over time. And there's some really interesting examples of place names and how they moved between the Irish language, the English language, and then back maybe to the Irish language and changed again into the English language. So they didn't always take a very straightforward route. And what happened was, whenever English was then, I suppose, the primary language here, these place names were adapted to suit the English language. And this was, I suppose, it never was a decision made by any one person to adapt these place names, but there was a general consensus at the time that these place names had to be understood. Whenever maps were being drawn, whenever there were surveyors trying to conduct, I suppose, work on the land and map Ireland at the time, there was a need to understand these place names. So these place names became anglicised for the most part, and by looking into these anglicised forms, a lot of which we see today, and looking through these historical records, and then of course that local knowledge. So you can't, I suppose you can't underestimate the impact that local knowledge can have on place names. For example, at home here, there's a road called, if you looked at it, you would pronounce it Drumbane Road. It's Drumbane. So to a local or to a non-local, this would be pronounced Drumbane Road, but to a local person, it's wrong to call it Drumbane Road. It's very much Drumbane Road. And that kind of shows that, that lineage from the original language of the Irish language, even though it's very many English speakers, people that don't speak Irish, that are using these place names. It's very much Drumbane Road. And my mother would not like it to be called anything else. And that's showing, I suppose, through time, that oral tradition, these place names being passed from generation to generation and then changing into these different forms over time. So place names were modified, as I said, over time. So the majority of our place names originally were written in the Irish language, and then over time they became changed and they took different forms. And these forms could really be, I suppose, summed up or divided into three primary categories. The first would have been through translation from Irish into English. And I suppose one of the issues with translation at this time was that we had groups of monolingual speakers. So rather than having groups of speakers of more than one language, for a lot of the part, we had many Irish speakers that maybe didn't speak much English and English speakers that didn't speak much Irish. So it became difficult to, of course, translate place names directly to their, and have their meanings understood by those who were mapping. So we had, in some rarer occasions, so this is by far not the most popular means that place names were changed, We had some people who did translate and were able to translate, and we see this shining through in the place names that we use today. And an example of this would be Tanderagee. So Tanderagee is the Irish for the field of saints. And very much today in the place name Saint Field, we can see that that was a direct translation. Secondly, then many of our place names were given a new name in English. So this was a renaming model. And an example of this would be a place name like Eglinton. Eglinton, which was named after the Lord Lieutenant, was actually originally called Anwye, which is Amai is a plain or a field or a piece of land, and that was the original name. It did get changed to Muff in between times, but then in later times it was given a brand new name, and that was Eglinton, and that's the name that we would associate most with that area today. And then thirdly, this was by far the most popular way that our place names were changed over time, and this was a process of Anglicisation. So this was really where the way I explain it is that if you think we had monolingual speakers and we had English speakers' ears hearing Irish speakers' words, and a lot of the time they wrote down what they heard according to the English language. So according to the language that they were fluent in, they rewrote these place names, but they still had some representation. They still often, for example, when we look at Culrahan, you can see that the element of the C, that K sound at the start and the R element in the middle still remains, but it changed shape. So it looks slightly different, but there are similarities. And then of course there's similarities when we think back to the pronunciation, Culrahan changing to Coleraine. And this would have happened in a number of ways. As far as I understand, there would have been, I suppose, people listening at a direct level, listening to natives of these different regions, of these different areas, pronouncing these townland names or these place names, and then they would have written them down from there. But then there also would have been scribes who had been copying place names that they saw on maps. And some of these wouldn't have been very easy to make out, particularly if they didn't represent a word that someone could copy over. So there was a lot of copying done, and then this would have made it even more complex of a process in that the place names were continuously changing shape and form over time, and we can follow that trajectory in various place names. So when we think of the influences of languages, and I suppose some of the languages that have left their footprint on our place names, Old Norse coming from when the Vikings invaded Ireland, and when we think of place names like Strangford, Carlingford, these were words that came from the Old Norse language. So that we can see there Strangfjord, strong sea inlet, and it's no surprise given the placement of Strangford on the coast that it makes a reference to the sea. And the same is done in Carlingford, which came from the Old Norse Curlingfjord, and this meant the narrow sea inlet of the Hag. And again, if you think of the placement, the geographical location of Carlingford, it's really no surprise that this place name makes reference to the sea. And in terms of the Old Norse place names, we see predominantly Old Norse place names on the east coast of Ireland, because of course that was the primary, I suppose, part of the country that at the time the Vikings invaded. So it tells us, it makes sense. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. It's like joining the dots. When you kind of piece in the place name along with that, it fits along with what we know, and it can tell us a little bit more even about what happened at the time and how the place was named, and really the legacy that has been left from that. And it still exists today, just when we do a little bit more digging into that meaning. Local place name Port Stewart, thinking of that's an English language place name, and that's named from Lieutenant Stewart of the nearby townland of Ballintoy, who in 1734 obtained a lease of the land from the Earl of Antrim. And the modern town was then established at a slightly later period by John Crummy, and his father had purchased the land from the Stuarts at the time. So Port Stuart, again, and if we do a little bit of digging into that, it brings us right back to Lieutenant Stuart and 1734, and tells us an awful lot about how that place name was given at the time. And we should say that we see most of the influence from the English language on place names in terms of renaming, or in terms of English language place names being coined in the English language in the 12th century, and then in the 17th century onwards as well. Scots, we also see Scots in our place names, and an example of that will be Kirkestown. So we see this element Kirk in a few place names, and this is the Scottish word for a church. Scots word for church, and English then town. So again, it's very easy to, I suppose, at times identify some English language place names, because as English speakers we can recognize some of the words that are used, such as town, in those place names. So Kirkestown, so the Scots element Kirk Church appears in many Ulster place names, Kirkhill in County Antrim, Kirkland in County Down, and unlike in another Kirkestown in Down, there's a clear ecclesiastical connection here with a church and a graveyard and a manse within the townland. So we see primarily that Scots influence in Ulster, particularly in Antrim and Donegal. So I suppose what I kind of looked at then when I was thinking of a few different place names, as I mentioned at the start, to choose out, I looked at a few places that I maybe hadn't seen, or I had seen somewhere else, and that I wondered, is this a direct kind of repetition of this place name somewhere else? And I found this small townland up on the coast just between Portrush and Dunluce, and it's Tanderagee. So of course, whenever I saw it, I thought, well, that's very similar to Tanderagee that I've drove through many times, and it was kind of intriguing, and it did have the same meaning. It came from the same Irish language words, Tanderagee, the backside to the wind, and it's the very same meaning in Tanderagee, the other Tanderagee. But of course, we see just a difference in the anglicisation. So we see here Tanderagee, whilst you would also see Tanderagee. So it just shows how that kind of copying, that listening, that anglicisation, the transliteration process, how it changed place names in different places. And it had a lot to tell us an awful lot about pronunciation and dialects as well, of course, in the Irish language many years ago. So this particular townland is in the parish of Dunluce, which is Dunluce. Dunluce is actually a really interesting place name as well. You can hear the similarity between Dunluce as we know it today and Dunluce. And Dun and Luce are two separate words in Irish, but they were brought together in this case to mean a fortress, and that fortress refers to the castle, Dunluce Castle, where that's situated now, or to which the ruins are situated now. And Dun is the Irish language word for a fort. So we see this an awful lot in our place names. It's a very common element. It's seen in County Down, Downpatrick, many places. Ballydownfine, for example, we see Down an awful lot, or Dun, D-U-N as well, or Dunamanagh, for example, Dunamanagh, the fort of the monks. So we see that a lot in our place names. But then this second element, Liss, we also see it in our place names. We were somewhere today that was Lislee, which came from Lisleagh, the Grey Fort. If you also think of Néill College, for example, that comes from Néill, Niall's fort. And really a Liss was another word for a fort, and more specifically a ring fort. So we see these two words brought together to form Dunluce. Going back to then the main place name of this page, then Tanderagee, Tanderagee, the backside to the wind. This place name is seen frequently in Ireland, but particularly on hills. And again, whenever we understand that original meaning of the place name, we can understand why that place got that particular name. And this particular townland doesn't have any substantial hills, so it doesn't entirely make sense. But then whenever you look at its exposed location on the north coast, it makes it a very appropriate name. Obviously, somewhere that would be very, very windy and exposed to the elements. There is an earlier place name in use for this particular townland, and that's it's transcribed, or it's recorded as Cullinagore. And in 1657, and that could maybe mean Culnagawer or Culnanawer, the corner of the goats. So we see, because we can use any piece of written evidence or written record as evidence, we can see some different names being used within even small townlands themselves. As you can see in the map, it's not a very big townland, and even within that, there's 2 place names that you could use for it. This was a particularly different place name that I came across, Urbalreagh. The Ray element isn't so much uncommon in that the word, if you think of Castle Ray, Castlin Riawak, that Ray often comes from Riawak, which is a word that would have been used in Irish place names, which means grey. But this Urbal really confused me when I first saw it, because it didn't I suppose I didn't see any other place names like this, or hadn't seen other to this point, and it's an arable, so again you can hear that connection with the Irish in terms of the pronunciation, and then that anglicisation. So Urbalreagh, Urbalreagh, the grey tail. Or sometimes it can mean a kind of a long or a narrow townland or field or place. So whenever you look at that word Urbal, it means a tail. It can be seen in place names when describing long, narrow pieces of land, which is the case here. So if we look just where Urbalreagh is, which is right here, we can actually see that it almost really identically represents a tail when you look at that from that aerial view, and there's 6 townlands in Ireland with this anglicised Urbal form, so it's not very common. It's actually more uncommon than common, I suppose. But it's just interesting that whenever you get that aerial view, you can really link up and understand why people may have called that Urbalreagh, the grey tail, or the long strip of land, because that's essentially what it is, and they would have experienced that living there. Another one that I hadn't really came across in the district when I was looking was Revallagh, and there's a Revallagh, and my apologies if I'm not pronouncing these right, because again, local people are best placed to tell us how to pronounce these in today's world. Revallagh, there's a north and south, so there's 2 of them. So we can see here Revallagh north, and then we can see Revallagh or Revallagh south as well. That comes from the Irish words Revallagh, which would have been the fort of the curses, which is a really interesting place name in terms of its meaning. The fort of the curses. It must have had some bad luck maybe attained to it. But whenever you look at the different maps that you can use, so this was an Ordnance Survey map, and I showed that at the start and talked about how these different maps can influence the kind of work and the outcomes of the research into place names. And what you can see here is a fortified fort here still on this map. So you can see again the clues to the meaning of the place names, and that being the fort of the curses. This particular place name, this townland, is in the parish of Ballintoy, which I'm sure we've all heard of before, Urbalreagh Singan. And that final Singan wouldn't have been, I've never seen that particular element before, but it actually refers to St. John. And that would have been a word given to that place, and its ecclesiastical link in that sense. So again, another really interesting place name, and we're seeing another word being used for fort. So if you haven't noticed by now that there were many forts in Ireland historically then, and right around us, all around us really, in many places here, in many local places. Well, hopefully you can see now that every time you see that word done, it came from dun most of the time. Every time you see that lis, came from Lios, lis, meaning a ring fort. And here's our third word for a fort, rath. And rath would have been more so a word used in southern parts of Ireland historically. We would have made much more use of dun, and we see that much more commonly here, but it doesn't mean that it's not seen at any point. And then this was one that I chose because it's a well-known place name, Ballintoy, Revallagh and Tuatha, and just to highlight this word Bally or Bal in our place names, because it has to be said it's one of the most common elements in our place names. And there was a map posted to, an aerial shot of Ireland posted to social media in the past few months, maybe even a year ago, and it showed an aerial view of all the valleys right across Ireland. It was really kind of magnificent and spectacular, and seeing quite how many there was. But if I'm sure everybody could think of many place names that begin with Bally, and often that it could have came from a few different words, but a lot of the time it came from this word Bwalya, which meant a townland or a settlement. So it's just like the way we use town today, I suppose, in English, or townland. It was a very common element. It also could have came from a word Balach as well, or Bel Aha. So Balach would have been a passageway or a way or a passage, I suppose, in a place, which would have places would have got that historically. And then as well, it could have been Bel Aha. So Bel is in the Irish word for mouth, and Aha, a ford in a river, so the mouth of the ford of, and there would usually be something that would follow that a lot of the time. And then just looking at some that I found that came from other languages in place names, and it was really so interesting. So I found a townland called Beardyville, and I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing it again, but we can see Beardyville is just here. It's right beside Revallagh as well, and Beardyville is actually a combination most likely of the English language and French or Latin. So we know that the final element is derived from French or Latin ville, meaning a city or a town, and we see that in a few place names here. The first element, beardy, is more obscure, it's more difficult, but it's thought to have came from the English surname beard. It could also came from which came from the Middle English bird. It could be a locative name, or it could also reference to an Irish language word, which is an English language word, bird, as we know, and that could have a connection as well to Irish surnames with the element Ian. So you would hear some Irish surnames like O'Hianach, for example, and that first element Ian meaning bird. So there's many possibilities in terms of that, and I think projects like the Northern Ireland Place Names projects are just so important to be on the ground, in the likes of Queen's University or Ulster University or wherever, and their place. It's important that we have people researching these, because as you can see, that you really don't know where these place names will take you to, or what language they could refer to, and it tells you a lot about the area. Another one that was interesting, and again a combination of languages in this place name, is Carnkirk. So Carn would have been a common word in place names. If you think of Carnlough, for example, you see this word cairn, and that referenced a cairn, so a heap or a mound of stones, and it often refers to a cairn which was, or sometimes can be, still visible. And it's very common in place names. And again, then we see this element, kirk, which we talked about earlier on, and that element, kirk, referring to this Scots church, a word in Scots meaning church. And we can see this then, Carnkirk mapped on this Ordnance Survey map from 1832 to 1846. And as well as that, whenever you look through some of the documents that have been collected on the likes of the NI Sites and Monuments database, you can see, you can read and tell that Carnkirk is thought to have been here, just where Carnkirk Castle then was placed, and that was the name given to it. So often you see very important features of that particular townland or that landscape come into focus in the place name, and I suppose dominating the place name then in that sense. So this is just part of I suppose my local area. And I thought I'd maybe just round up by just looking at the kind of the diversity that we see in all the elements that make up our place names. Where I'm from, I'm not sure about yourselves, but we use our townland names. We describe where people live by using our townland names rather than our road names. And I think this is a really important practice. It's part of that oral tradition, and it's something that we should really make an effort to keep alive. So we've got townland names like Gort Fad, which came from the Irish Gort Fada, the long field. So anytime you see that element Gort, it often means is referring to a field. We see other elements like Mahara Moor, and whenever you see that Mahara or Mahara or Mahar in a place name, it often refers to a plain, or a plain or a land, and then moor comes from that Irish word mo fada r, pronounced more, just the same, meaning big or great. So the great or the big plain, as you can see, it's quite a large townland, so it makes sense. Some others that we see, two interesting ones were the two in the middle, which is Farn Temple Glebe and Ballintoy. So Farn Temple and Ballintoy would be the names that we would use locally. A lot of the time you wouldn't have the element Glebe in the end, in our everyday speech. But Farn Temple would have meant the land of the church, and this would have been land that maybe would have supported a church in some way. And right beside it then we see Ballintoy comes from that common word Boalia, Boalia and Chempel, the townland of the church. And though the church and the graveyard is still very clear to be seen in that townland today, so it very much makes sense. Bracha then, for example, Bracha is the speckled or the rocky place, but it also could have potentially came from the word Brochach, which would have referenced a badger den as well. So, again, there's possibilities. Sometimes it's very difficult, no matter how much research is done by the likes of the Place Names Project and by local people, it's difficult to come on the precise to really come to a final answer. I suppose there never is a final answer to the meaning of lots of these place names. Lis na Scrayhog. So again, you see Lis, which is that reference to a fort, and hopefully you can see in the map that ring fort right there. There's now a dwelling actually inside that, and there is the kind of fort resemblance is very much still there. And Slackdaverty or Slacktaverty has got a legend associated with it. So slacked comes from the word lacht in Irish, meaning a gravestone. And then we have Awertach for the second element, and that was the name of an evil kind of person who was associated with the area, and they were buried. They were buried and came back. They were described as a magician. They came back and haunted people, and they were killed. This person was killed and buried again. and said by Finn McCool as well, to have done this. And then the third time they were buried upside down, and it was thought that this would mean that they would never be able to get themselves out of the tombstone again, and thankfully they didn't, to my knowledge anyway. So it just shows, I suppose, the diversity that we see and the different elements that we see coming into play in our place names, different people, different stories, local legends, descriptions of the land, descriptions of the features of the land, so be that man-made or be that associated with human practice, and then actual local names as well. So I just wanted to finish off by addressing and I suppose pointing us towards our podcast series. We have a video series as well, which has just been launched. We've released one video which looks at Derry and a lot of the local place names associated with that area and different themes that we see. And this is a bilingual podcast series, so we speak to lots of local experts on place names. So in our first episode we talked to Professor Néill Amwanyin, our second episode with Dr. Néill Comer, our third episode with Dr. Francis Kane. And they're all about 30 minutes each, so not too long. Our fourth with Jaiglin O'Divlin talking about Mid-Ulster place names. Our fifth is such an interesting episode. It talks about the whole concept of townlands and the oral tradition and how important it is to I suppose keep townlands being used and understand what they mean and encourage young people and everybody in the local area to really embrace their townlands and use them as much as they can. And this is with Una Walsh, who does an awful lot of work in Armagh and has erected lots of townland stone markers on the boundaries of townlands right across County Armagh. And it's we went and saw a few today, and it was really, really interesting. We talked to Dr. Kay Moore about the similarities between the name and surnames and the place names. So similarities between these two traditions. And on our final episode, we have a panel discussion with three of our panelists, which we had for single podcast episodes, and then also with Linda Irvine as well. And that's a really interesting one. So I could talk all night, but I want to say a huge Gura Míle Maithugah for listening. Thank you all very much for listening to me. And if you have any questions, I can't promise that I'll have the answers, but feel free to ask them. Huge thanks to Nick as well for inviting me to speak. And finally then, I suppose a huge thank you to our funders, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and as well to Place Names NI, who have really enhanced the project with all the research that they do and all the work that they continue to do on working out the linguistic origins of our place names. And they have been really pivotal in helping progress this project. And I'm going to put in a link to our booklet, which talks about place names, different themes and place names. So I'll put that into the group chat now, and I'll just stop sharing the screen as well, and we can